My mother had only one lesson for me, and she taught it to me every single day. The lesson was that I was useless, that I was a burden, that the very space I occupied in the world was a debt I could never repay. This wasn't a lesson taught with textbooks and quiet instruction. It was a lesson branded onto my soul with the searing heat of her words, the chilling emptiness of her eyes, and the deafening silence of a home where love was a foreign language. This is a story about breaking a curse. It's about the quiet war waged inside the four walls of a family home, and the decision to build a new world from the rubble of the old one. It's for anyone who has ever been made to feel small by the very people who were supposed to build them up. If you believe that the deepest revenge is not to destroy, but to create something so beautiful that your abuser can never touch it, then stick around. And while you're here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You'll want to see how this cycle is finally and completely broken. The first time I remember hearing the word useless, I was 5 years old. The memory is painted in the colors of a dreary Tuesday afternoon, the sky outside our kitchen window the color of a dirty dishcloth. I was trying to help. That was always my first mistake. Trying. I wanted to pour my own glass of milk, a monumental task for a child whose hands were still learning the map of her own body. I was concentrating so hard, my tongue sticking out from the corner of my mouth, my small fingers wrapped around the heavy, sweating carton. And then, inevitably, it happened. The carton tipped too far, the white liquid splashing onto the worn linoleum floor in a shape that looked like a weeping ghost. I froze. The glugging sound of the spilled milk was instantly replaced by a silence that was far louder, far more terrifying. I didn't dare look up, but I could feel her presence fill the doorway. Margaret, my mother. Her shadow fell over me before her voice did. Look at that. Just look at it. Her voice wasn't a yell. It was worse. It was a low, guttural sigh of profound disappointment, the sound of a final straw being placed on a camel's already broken back. Can't you do one simple thing right? Honestly, Olivia, you're useless. There it was. The word. It landed on me like a physical weight, pressing the air from my lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping to disappear. The smell of the souring milk, the cold of the linoleum seeping through my socks, the heavy thud of my own heart, it all blended into a single, suffocating moment of shame. She didn't clean it up. She made me do it, my small hands struggling with a rag that was too big, smearing the milk into a sticky, translucent film while she stood over me, watching, judging. That day set the template for my entire childhood. The lesson was reinforced with brutal consistency. When I brought home a report card with a string of B's and C's, it was, "Is this the best you can do? Do you even try? You have a good enough brain, but you're too lazy to use it. Useless." It was never a question of if I needed help or if I was struggling. It was a verdict on my character. When my first attempt at baking a birthday cake for her, a lopsided, slightly burnt chocolate mess made with all my saved-up allowance money, came out of the oven, she looked at it with a detached sort of pity. "Well, I suppose it's the thought that counts," she'd said, taking a tiny, clinical bite. "But let's not waste the ingredients again." The cake sat on the counter for 3 days, untouched, a monument to my failure, before she threw it in the bin. Margaret operated on a simple, cruel philosophy, that the world was a hard place, and her job was to make me harder. She called it building strength. She said she was preparing me for the disappointments of life. What she was actually doing was creating them. She was the primary source of my pain, the architect of my anxiety. Tenderness was a weakness. A hug was a surrender. A word of praise was a lie that would make me soft. The house itself seemed to absorb her philosophy. It was always neat, always clean, but it was sterile. The air was thin and smelled of lemon polish and unspoken resentment. There were no photographs on the walls, no clumsy, colorful drawings taped to the refrigerator. It wasn't a home, it was a showroom for a life that had no joy in it. My siblings, two older brothers, learned to survive in their own ways. They became distant, sarcastic echoes of her, learning early that the best way to avoid her criticism was to join in on it, often with me as the target. They built walls, and I learned to live in the silence behind them. I became a ghost in my own house, learning to move quietly, to expect nothing, to make myself as small as possible. I found solace in books, in stories of worlds where mothers were kind and homes were safe. I lived a vibrant, colorful life inside my own head, because the one outside of it was painted in 50 shades of gray. The years passed in this quiet misery. High school was a blur of trying to be invisible. When I experienced my first real heartbreak at 17, I made the mistake of crying in the living room. Margaret walked in, saw my tear-streaked face, and didn't soften. She stiffened. "Oh, for heaven's sake, what now?" she'd asked, her arms crossed. He broke up with me," I sobbed, the words feeling fragile and foolish in the cold air. She let out that same sigh, the one from the kitchen floor all those years ago. "Olivia, you are far too sensitive. You let every little thing break you. Do you think the world is going to stop and hold your hand every time some boy doesn't call you back? Toughen up. Crying about it is useless." I fled to my room, the sobs caught in my throat like shards of glass. That was the night I truly understood. There was a hollow space in my mother where a heart was supposed to be, and no amount of my own love or my own pain could ever hope to fill it. From that day on, I never cried in front of her again. I built a fortress around my own heart, not to keep others out, but to protect it from her. WY21, I was working a dead-end job at a local diner, trying to save enough money to get my own apartment, a tiny shoebox, anything that was mine. I was still living at home, the daily chill of my mother's presence a constant, low-grade fever. And then, 2 pink lines on a plastic stick changed everything. Pregnant. The word was both a terror and a miracle. My boyfriend, a sweet but directionless boy from my high school, had panicked and vanished, leaving me utterly, terrifyingly alone. For a week, I was paralyzed by fear. My mother's voice was a permanent resident in my mind, a chorus of every useless and pathetic she had ever thrown at me. How could I, a girl who could barely take care of herself, possibly take care of a baby? But then, something else began to stir within me. A fierce, primal instinct I didn't know I possessed. It was a tiny flicker of hope in the vast darkness of my fear. A baby. A person who I could love unconditionally. A chance to build a world completely different from the one I knew. A chance to be a mother. The kind of mother I had always dreamed of. I decided to tell her. A part of me, a small, foolish, 5-year-old part, still yearned for her approval. It hoped, against all evidence, that this news, the news of a grandchild, might finally break through the ice. That she might see me not as a failure, but as a woman on the cusp of creating a family. I found her in the living room, reading a magazine, the lamplight carving sharp angles onto her face. The air was thick with the impending storm. My hands were clammy, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper. She looked up, her eyes impatient over the rim of her reading glasses. "What is it, Olivia?" "I'm busy. I have something to tell you," I stammered, twisting the hem of my shirt. I'm pregnant." I said the words. I put them out into the cold, sterile air of that room, and for a moment, they just hung there. She didn't move. Her face was a mask of stone. She slowly took off her glasses, folded them with meticulous precision, and placed them on the side table. Then her eyes, cold and clear as a winter sky, met mine. A slow, cruel smile, more of a sneer, spread across her lips. "A child," she said, the words dripping with a venom that made my blood run cold. "From you. You can't even take care of yourself. You can't hold down a decent job, you can't manage your own money, you can't even keep a man." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, cutting whisper. "That poor baby. That poor baby will grow up just as pathetic as its mother. And there it was. The final, fatal blow. It wasn't just about me anymore. She had taken her poison and aimed it at the innocent, unborn life inside me. In that moment, the flicker of hope I'd felt didn't die. It erupted into a wildfire. The terrified girl who had spent her life flinching from this woman vanished. In her place stood a mother, ready to defend her child from the very first monster it would ever face. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just stared at her, the woman who was my mother but had never been my mom, and I saw her for what she was, a black hole of bitterness, trying to pull everything and everyone into her own empty darkness. I turned without another word and walked out of the room. I went to my own room, the one that had been my prison and my sanctuary, and I began to pack. It didn't take long. My life fit into a single suitcase and 2 cardboard boxes. I packed my books, a few worn-out clothes, and a small, framed photo of a beach I'd always dreamed of seeing. I left behind every trace of the girl she thought I was. As I stood at the front door, suitcase in hand, she appeared at the end of the hallway, a silhouette against the dim light. She didn't move to stop me. She just watched. "You'll be back," she called out, her voice echoing in the silent house. "The world will chew you up and spit you out, and you'll come crawling back. You're not strong enough to make it on your own." I didn't look back. I opened the door, and the cool night air felt like the first clean breath I had ever taken. I stepped out, closing the door gently behind me. The click of the latch was the sound of a cage door swinging shut, but with me on the outside. As I walked down the dark, silent street, I made a vow. I whispered it to the tiny, sleeping life inside me. "You will never know this cold. You will never hear those words. I will build you a world so full of warmth and light that it will leave no room for shadows." I didn't know how I was going to do it. I had no money, no plan, and no one to call. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't useless. I was a fortress. And the long, lonely war for my son's happiness had just begun. The first few years were a lesson in survival, taught in the harsh classrooms of run-down apartments and graveyard shifts. I found a tiny, one-room place on the other side of town, a place where the walls were thin enough to hear my neighbors' arguments and the radiator clanked a mournful, rhythmic tune all through the night. The window looked out onto a brick wall, but to me, it was the most beautiful view in the world, because it wasn't the view from my mother's house. The freedom was so potent, so intoxicating, that it tasted sweeter than any meal I could afford. And I could afford very little. Being pregnant and alone is a special kind of terrifying. The world suddenly feels like it's full of sharp edges. Every dollar was a victory, every meal a triumph of budgeting. I kept my job at the diner, my belly swelling against the stained apron, my feet aching with a fire that shot up to my spine. Some nights, after a double shift, I'd sit on my lumpy mattress, eating dry cereal from a box, and the sheer weight of my reality would press down on me. In those moments of crushing loneliness, Margaret's voice would slither into my thoughts, a venomous whisper. "You're not strong enough. You'll come crawling back." I'd place a hand on my belly, feel the gentle flutter of movement inside, and the voice would fade. This wasn't just about me anymore. Failure was not an option. I was no longer just Olivia, the useless girl. I was a vessel. I was a shield. I was a mother. The thought was both a crushing weight and the only thing that gave me the strength to stand up. The day Daniel was born was the day my life truly began. The world shifted from black and white to dazzling, overwhelming color. When they placed him in my arms, a tiny, red-faced, screaming miracle, the hollow space in my own chest that Margaret had carved out was instantly filled. It was a love so fierce, so absolute, it was like staring into the sun. I looked into his scrunched-up, perfect face and I wept, not with the sad, broken tears of my childhood, but with tears of profound, earth-shattering joy. I was holding my own heart in my arms. "Hello, Daniel," I whispered, my voice thick. "It's me. It's your mom. And I've got you." I will always have you. Raising him was like learning to breathe all over again. Every day was a conscious, deliberate act of rebellion against my own upbringing. Where Margaret had given silence, I gave songs, silly, off-key lullabies that made him giggle. Where she had given criticism, I gave praise for every clumsy, wonderful achievement. His first smile, the first time he rolled over, the first time he scribbled a crayon masterpiece on the wall. Instead of scolding him for the last one, I carefully cut out that section of drywall before we moved and framed it. It was a masterpiece because he had made it. Our tiny apartment, which could have felt like a cage, became a fortress of warmth. I painted the walls bright, cheerful yellow. I filled the space with secondhand books and the smell of baking cookies, even if it was just the cheap, break-apart kind. Laughter was the soundtrack to our lives. When Daniel scraped his knee at the park, my first instinct wasn't a sigh of annoyance, but a rush of empathy. I'd scoop him up, kiss the wound, and tell him how brave he was. I told him it was okay to cry, that his feelings were important. Every act of tenderness was a brick I was laying in the wall, separating my son's world from the one I had escaped. There were hard times. So many hard times. There was the winter the heating broke and we had to sleep in our coats, huddled together under every blanket we owned. There was the time Daniel got a terrible fever and I sat up with him all night, terrified and alone, placing cool cloths on his forehead and praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in. In those moments of weakness, the temptation to call her was a physical ache. Just to have another adult. Just to have a mother. But then I'd remember her face, the sneer as she spoke of my unborn child, and the ache would turn to steel. I would not let her poison touch him. I would rather break than bend back toward her. I worked. God, how I worked. I cleaned houses during the day, the smell of bleach clinging to my clothes, and took shifts at the diner at night. I enrolled in an online course at the local community college, studying bookkeeping late at night after Daniel was asleep, my eyes burning from the screen, my mind fuzzy with exhaustion. Every small step forward was a victory. Every dollar saved was a stone in the foundation of our new life. Slowly, agonizingly, things began to change. I finished my bookkeeping course and got a job as a receptionist at a small accounting firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. It had regular hours. It had benefits. For the first time, I could breathe. I could afford to take Daniel to the zoo. I could buy him the bright red sneakers he wanted instead of the generic ones from the discount bin. These were not small things. They were everything. We moved to a new apartment. A 2-bedroom place with a small balcony and a window that overlooked a park. It felt like a palace. Daniel finally had his own room, which we decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. Our fortress was getting bigger, stronger. And it wasn't just the two of us anymore. I started building a family of my own choosing. There was Mrs. Gable, the elderly woman who lived next door and became Daniel's surrogate grandmother, slipping him cookies and reading him stories. There was Sarah, another single mom from the park, who became my lifeline. We traded babysitting, shared cheap bottles of wine after the kids were asleep, and understood each other's exhaustion and joy without having to say a word. My friends, my found family, taught me that love wasn't a weakness. It was a utility. It was the electricity that powered our lives, the water that quenched our thirst. My capacity to love, the very thing my mother had called my greatest flaw, was in fact my greatest strength. It had saved me. It was building a beautiful life for my son. By the time Daniel was 10, our life was unrecognizable from the one I had fled. I had worked my way up at the firm to a junior accountant position. We had a comfortable routine, a home filled with warmth, and a community that held us. The ghost of Margaret had started to fade. Her voice was no longer a constant torment, but a faint, distant echo, a reminder of a battle I had already won. I hadn't spoken to her, or any of my family, in a decade. I assumed, and was content with the assumption, that I never would again. The door I had closed all those years ago felt like it was on a different planet. I had built a new world, a new galaxy, for myself and my son. And I thought, foolishly, that its orbit would never be disturbed. I thought the past was finally and truly in the past. But the universe has a funny way of testing the strength of the walls you build. And one cool autumn evening, as the leaves outside our window were turning brilliant shades of orange and red, the past came knocking. Literally. A knock on the door, sharp and unfamiliar, cutting through the comfortable sound of Daniel reading aloud to me from his favorite book. A knock that, for some reason, made the hair on my arms stand up. A knock that I knew, with a sudden gut-wrenching certainty, would change everything all over again. "I'll get it," Daniel chirped, already scrambling off the sofa, his book left open on the cushion. "Hold on, buddy, let me," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. A strange, cold dread was coiling in my stomach. It was the kind of primal, instinctual fear you feel just before the thunder cracks, a shift in the atmospheric pressure of your own soul. We weren't expecting anyone. Our friends, our found family, they never knocked. They'd call out from the hallway or just walk in. A formal knock was for strangers, for salespeople, or for ghosts. I walked to the door, my heart starting a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I glanced through the peephole, and the world tilted on its axis. The distorted fisheye view showed me a face I hadn't seen in 10 years, yet one that was etched into the very fiber of my being. It was Margaret. My breath hitched. For a long second, I couldn't move. I was 21 again, standing in her doorway with a suitcase. I was 17, choking back sobs in my bedroom. I was 5, staring at a puddle of spilled milk. A decade of healing, of building, of carefully constructed peace, threatened to crumble in the face of the architect of my original pain. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling slightly. Part of me, the wounded child, wanted to pretend no one was home, to turn off the lights, hide in the back room, and wait for her to go away. But then I heard Daniel behind me. "Who is it, Mom?" His voice, so full of innocent curiosity, was the anchor that pulled me back to the present. I was not that terrified girl anymore. I was a 31-year-old woman. I was a mother. This was my home, my fortress. And I was the one in charge of the gate. I took a deep, steadying breath, turned the lock, and opened the door. She looked old. It was the first thing I noticed. The 10 years that had been a period of growth and strength for me had been a decade of erosion for her. Her once impeccably styled hair was thinner now, and a flat, lifeless gray. The sharp, cutting intelligence in her eyes had been replaced by a watery, desperate uncertainty. The severe, tailored clothes she always wore were now just a baggy, ill-fitting costume on a frame that had grown frail. She seemed smaller, as if the world had finally managed to shrink her down to size. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the threshold. It was a chasm of 10 years, filled with unspoken words, unhealed wounds, and 2 completely different universes. She was looking past me, into the warmth and light of my home. I could see her eyes taking in the colorful paintings on the wall, the messy pile of board games on the coffee table, the scent of the chicken roasting in the oven. She was looking at a world she couldn't possibly comprehend, a world built with the emotional tools she had always scorned. "Olivia," she whispered, and her voice was a shock. The once commanding, steel-edged instrument that had flayed me 1,000 times was now brittle, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was the voice of a stranger. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The words were trapped in my throat, a logjam of anger, pity, and a profound, aching sadness for the relationship we never had. Daniel, sensing the tension, peeked out from behind my legs. He was holding his book, his finger still marking his page. His face was open, curious, and completely unafraid. "Who's this, Mom?" he asked, his voice clear and bright in the heavy silence. His question broke the spell. It was the moment the past collided with the present. I looked down at my son, my beautiful, happy, confident son, the living embodiment of my victory. He was the reason I was strong. He was the proof that her philosophy of cruelty was a lie. I looked at his bright, curious eyes, and then I looked back at the woman who stood shivering on my doorstep. The woman who had sworn he would grow up pathetic. And in that instant, I knew exactly what I had to do. The revenge I was about to take wasn't something I had plotted for years in a dark room. I had never fantasized about her downfall or wished for her misery. My energy had been focused on building, not destroying. But now, with her standing here, trying to breach the walls of the world I had built, the path forward was clear. The revenge wasn't about hurting her. It was about protecting him. It was about honoring the vow I had made to him on the night I left. I had to prepare myself for what she was going to ask. Desperation was rolling off of her in waves. This wasn't a social call. This wasn't an attempt at reconciliation. This was a last resort. I started to piece together a narrative, a silent hypothesis for her sudden appearance. My brothers had been her disciples in cruelty. They would never have learned the empathy required to care for an aging parent. Her husband, my father, had been a passive enabler, and without him, her world would have lost its anchor. Her friends, if she ever had any true ones, would have eventually tired of her bitterness. She had systematically isolated herself over a lifetime, and now, at the end of it, she was finally feeling the cold. This wasn't a plan for revenge. This was the planning for a final confrontation. My mind raced, not with schemes, but with boundaries. What would I say? How would I maintain the calm that was now my armor? How could I explain this to Daniel in a way that he would understand, without tainting him with the poison of her legacy? The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Margaret's eyes flickered from me to Daniel and back again. She was waiting for an invitation, for a crack in my resolve, for the broken, needy daughter she remembered to surface. I saw your address on a piece of mail that was forwarded, she stammered, as if needing to explain her presence to justify this intrusion. From an old insurance policy. I just nodded, my face a calm, unreadable mask. I was giving her nothing. No anger, no pity, no welcome. I was a closed door, even while standing in an open doorway. Her composure finally crumbled. The carefully constructed facade of the strong, stoic matriarch shattered, and all that was left was a lonely, frightened old woman. My husband passed away last year, she said, her voice cracking. Your brothers, they don't call. All my friends have drifted away. The house, it's being sold. I have no one, Olivia. No one. Her eyes, for the first time in my life, filled with genuine tears. I need somewhere to stay. Just for a little while. Until I can figure things out. There it was. The ask. She wanted to come in. She wanted to plant the seed of her misery in the heart of my happiness. She wanted to take shelter in the very fortress I had built to keep her out. The little girl inside me, the one who had always craved her love, felt a pang of something sharp and painful. It was a ghost limb of an emotion, a flicker of the toxic, conditioned duty a child feels for a parent, no matter how undeserving. She's your mother, a voice whispered in the deepest part of my mind. You can't just turn her away. But then I felt Daniel's small hand slip into mine. His warmth, his solid, trusting presence, was a jolt of electricity. It incinerated the ghost of that scared little girl. I looked down at him, at his trusting face, and the path became crystal clear. My duty was not to the woman who gave me life only to try and poison it. My duty was to the boy I had brought into this world, the one I had sworn to protect. Looking at the woman who was my mother, I saw the full, tragic arc of her life. She had wagered everything on the belief that strength was a wall you built to keep the world out, and she had succeeded. She had built a fortress of solitude so impenetrable that, in the end, not even she could escape it. She stood on my doorstep not as a tyrant, but as a refugee from the barren kingdom she herself had created. And she was asking for asylum in mine. The air grew heavy as I held her watery, pleading gaze. Daniel's hand was a warm, solid anchor in mine, the weight of it reminding me of what was real, what was important. He was my truth. This home, this life, was my truth. She was a lie I had stopped believing in long ago. I finally found my voice, and when it came, it was soft, but it was unyielding, forged in the fires of 1,000 lonely nights and tempered by a decade of determined love. "This," I said, my voice clear and steady, my eyes never leaving hers, but my words aimed at my son's understanding. "This is someone who taught me a very important lesson, Daniel. She taught me exactly how not to raise you." The words landed in the space between us with a quiet finality. There was no malice in them, no gloating. It was simply the truth, spoken plainly. Margaret flinched as if I had slapped her. The tears that had been welling in her eyes finally spilled over, tracing paths through the wrinkles on her powdered cheeks. She looked, in that moment, utterly broken. A part of me, a deeply buried, vestigial piece of the daughter I once was, ached at the sight of her pain. But the love for my son was a roaring lion that drowned out that faint, sad whisper. "Please," she choked out, taking a clumsy step forward, her hand reaching out as if to grab my arm. "Olivia, please. I only ever wanted you to be strong." I took a half step back, pulling Daniel slightly behind me, breaking the potential connection. Her hand fell, empty, to her side. "No," I said, and the word was not harsh, but it was absolute. It was a wall of granite. "That isn't true. You didn't want me to be strong. You wanted me to be hard. Like you. You confused cruelty with strength, and you confused fear with respect. You wanted control. You never, not once, just wanted me. You didn't want the me that spilled milk, or got average grades, or cried over a boy. You didn't want a daughter. You wanted a monument to your own bitter philosophies." I paused, letting the words sink in, letting her see the lifetime of reflection that had gone into them. I looked around my warm, light-filled hallway, at the vibrant, messy, beautiful life that was a direct refutation of everything she believed. "You told me that my capacity for love, my sensitivity, was a weakness," I continued, my voice gaining a quiet power. "You told me it was useless. But you were wrong. It was the only thing that was ever useful. It's what built this home. It's what healed me. And it's the greatest gift I will ever give my son. I broke the cycle, Margaret. I took the poison you fed me, and instead of swallowing it, I learned how to turn it into medicine. And because of that, my son will never have to wonder if he is loved. He will never feel the cold that I felt. He will never, for a single second of his life, believe that he is useless." Every word was a declaration of independence, a reclaiming of my own narrative. I was no longer the subject of her story, she was a footnote in mine. She just stood there, weeping silently, the fight completely gone from her. She had no more words, no more weapons. All that was left was the hollowed-out core of her own making. She had lost. She hadn't just lost an argument, she had lost the entire war, because she had been fighting on the wrong side all along. I knew this was the last time I would ever see her. This was the final scene. There was nothing left to say. I began to close the door, slowly, gently, but without a flicker of hesitation. Her face, crumpled in despair, was the last thing I saw before the latch clicked into place. The sound was soft, but it echoed like a canyon, a definitive final end to the story of the daughter and the mother. The silence on our side of the door was profound. I stood there for a long moment, my forehead resting against the cool wood, my eyes closed. I took a deep, shuddering breath and let it out. The weight of my entire past, a weight I hadn't even realized I was still carrying, lifted from my shoulders. It was over. A small tug on my hand brought me back. I opened my eyes and looked down. Daniel was looking up at me, his brow furrowed with a concern that was so pure, so loving, It made my heart ache with gratitude. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice soft. I knelt down to his level, pulling him into a tight hug, burying my face in his soft hair that smelled of shampoo and little boy. I held him for a long time, drawing strength from his warmth. He was my safe harbor. He was my victory. I finally pulled back, cupping his face in my hands and kissing the top of his head. "I am now, baby," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I am more than okay." I stood up, took his hand, and we walked back into the living room. Through the large front window, I could see the streetlights beginning to glow against the deepening twilight. I didn't look to see if she was still there. It didn't matter. She was outside. We were inside. The house glowed with warmth, the smell of roasted chicken filled the air, and a half-read book of adventure lay waiting on the couch. It was a world she had never known how to create, and therefore could never be allowed to enter.